So we think that a response, an appropriate response, obviously, is to move into an open state of rebellion. If you look into the sort of political history, you'll find that politics has always recognised citizens' right and duty, in fact, to rebel against a government which is planning the death of millions of people, which we anticipate, or the destruction of the conditions for the security of its own people, which let's say they are definitely also engaging in. And when you meet political argument around this topic, it's useful to be able to explain to somebody that if you're radical and you believe in egalitarianism and justice and you think that people's human rights are important, then you might say that naturally those people on this end of the political spectrum, you know, they're against catastrophic climate change, and they're going to be okay to join a movement like this at a time like this. But equally, if you move to the other end and look at the conservative end of the spectrum, if you believe in people's right to property, and if you believe that the state should keep order and safety for people, then you also now have to be totally against the impacts of catastrophic climate change, because those things are in jeopardy as well. So we've tried to explain to people that you don't need to have a political consensus in the sense of right and left to be able to work together to try and push against what's coming in this crisis. It's also interesting that there are researchers among us. What we've done has been quite data driven and quite research heavy in terms of how it's been set up and how we've found our way to the tools that we've used to mobilise people. And lots of people think that in an ordinary sort of campaign you would find this distribution of people where you've got sort of the most people in the middle, and everybody's kind of spread to the right and the left, and you would have a certain amount of people who would take very radical action versus like a lot of people who might give up something small or sign a petition or give you £5 a month, versus like people who would deny it and not do anything at all. And people anticipate this kind of outline of like how people get engaged with something like this. And what we've found is that when you tell the truth, as we have done in these talks, there is a section of society who aren't bystanders, but they're upstanders, and they're at one end of the spectrum. If you speak the truth to people at a time like this and in this context, we find that there's a small percentage of those people who are being mobilised to act. And so when we sort of get people in a room and talk to them and take down people's details and ask if they'd be willing to get involved, maybe they'd be willing to risk arrest, go and sit in the street somewhere, take direct action, we have a relatively high percentage of people who say, I'm willing to act, even if it means making a personal sacrifice. And I think also the reflection that people have made on the Bernie Sanders campaign in the States is also interesting, that when you ask people to do something small and then the win is quite small, that you see a fairly small uptake. But if you ask people to make a very big sacrifice but the win is fucking massive, then actually quite a lot of people say, yeah, do you know what, I'd do that. If it wins that, and it might, then I'm going to try. That's worth upping the chances of success. And all the things that we've done have been trying to basically increase the chance that we do something that might make a meaningful change. So there are some quite hardline empiricist kind of based researchers among us who are very keen to work with data. There's somebody called Erica Chenoweth who's done a lot of research on how to what makes for successful non-violent movements and what gets you successful large-scale social and political change. And the data that they've gathered suggests that somewhere between 1% and 5% of the population of a country need to be mobilised at a time to win, potentially, in non-violent movement. And some of that data comes from stories involving these people, lots of them you might recognise. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, suffragettes. There's also Caroline Lucas, there's James Hansen being arrested. He's a climate scientist. He's one of the sort of godfathers of climate science, and he was one of the first scientists in the world, I believe, to go and take sort of direct action, put his own body on the line in the face of fossil fuel developments. And non-violent movement has a lot of celebrated success. There's a lot of people who like to talk about these people as very good people who did great things, but we don't really particularly like their tactics so much in the present, we find. So it's okay to sort of make a statue of the suffragettes or talk about what they won for women, but if somebody goes and smashes every window on Oxford Street, they don't really necessarily get sort of celebrated right immediately now, because the behaviours that you have to undertake to make these movements occur are not actually so comfortable. It's widely understood, I think, that a level of personal sacrifice is very helpful in the fact that when you're in a non-violent struggle, you're often against an opponent, let's say, or you're against a state probably who do have the opportunity to use violence, whether that's through the police or the army. And if you're not going to win on material grounds in that way, then you have to win on a kind of emotional and intellectual battleground. So maintaining non-violent discipline for Extinction Rebellion is crucially important. It's very unlikely that we'll win, we feel, if that gets broken. And it helps to win the hearts and minds of people. But also the data suggests that you're just more likely to see a lasting, successful change if you use non-violence versus if you use violent tactics. So it's not to say that violence can't work, but especially in a country like ours where we have the privilege of a largely unarmed police force who don't all carry huge guns and point them at you when you're doing protests. We have no excuse not to engage in this because it's statistically more likely to work, as well as being sort of morally pretty much there as well. These are the Freedom Riders. There's a really great film about them on YouTube if you want to watch it. They started a small part of the civil rights campaign in the United States. They were not really celebrated immediately by lots of other parts of the movement because people thought what they did was reckless. Basically, a bunch of students started off with just a handful of students who decided that they were going to break the bus segregation policy, and they got on in pairs, black and white students, sat next to each other and travelled down on the buses down towards the southern states. And it was anticipated that they would be harassed, attacked. People thought that they might be killed. Some of them were nearly killed in the process of taking these journeys. And when they got to the very end of this journey that they went on, many of them got put in prison for breaking the policies. And eventually, more and more students, as they got in jail, joined and went and did exactly the same thing. And it turned into something which had a very big impact on the overall civil rights movement, because when you have hundreds of innocent students in prison just for sitting on a bus next to each other, and that gets a huge amount of kind of international attention, then you can imagine what that does if your battleground is moral and emotional. So a bit of background on the rebellion. Rising Up was this group that was formed by a bunch of people who I now know very well and love, but before I met them, and they decided to try and build a network of activists who believed that mass participation in civil disobedience was something that was missing from the kind of direct action world. There were people engaged in direct action, but mostly in sort of fairly singular locations and using lots of sort of special equipment, lock-ons, and people climbing into try and shut down facilities and things like that. And actually the campaign successes of the past that I've just mentioned mostly involve very unskilled, ordinary people who go and sit somewhere they shouldn't be, or they go and spray something on a wall, or they just do something which is sort of more soft and more of a civil disobedience action than the sort of direct action that you might imagine when people do sort of much more hardcore things. And so understanding that this was a proven way to sort of elicit change, Rising Up set up, and they ran several campaigns. One successful one, which is how I got involved, was Roger Hallam did a divestment campaign at King's College. They had students campaigning there for several years, making very slow progress with the institution, asking them to divest from fossil fuels, so to pull out all of their investment from the fossil fuel industries and reinvest that in something else. He suggested to them that they should take some direct action. Not everybody agreed, but a few people did. And so he went and spray painted inside one of their main halls, did about £10,000 worth of damage. He painted again on the outside of the building. He was arrested again. I'm not sure what order this took place in precisely. He was kicked out of the university, which is where he was doing his PhD in how to design effective radical campaign strategy. And then he went on hunger strike for 2 weeks. And at the end of this process, I think it's about 5 weeks worth of causing trouble in a kind of escalating fashion, got a meeting there with, I think it was like the vice president or something like that, and they made an arrangement for divestment, and then it was done. He got reinserted at the institution, and thanked by them as well for doing it, for making it possible for them to run that through as quickly as he did, because otherwise they would never have been able to do it. So it's interesting because a lot of people say when you do this stuff, well, if you do that, then they won't respect you because that's you being a bad person, and you'll get arrested and you'll look bad and you'll look silly and they won't speak to you. And that's not what we found to be the case at all. This was an air pollution campaign which we did, which was pointing at Sadiq Khan, asking him to reduce the criminal level of air pollution in London. I got involved at this point, and we made these outfits because we were trying to get put on remand. So I made us all like these prison outfits to wear. And then another campaign that we worked on before we launched the rebellion was a very short thing with Vote No Heathrow. So when they said that they were going to put this policy proposal into Parliament, we went to see the Labour Party and said to them, you know, any progressive, decent party in this day and age who's got access to the science would run a 3-line whip against the expansion of an airport, because this carbon-heavy infrastructure will exist for a minimum of 40 years. It will get used as much as it possibly can because it's been built, and it will totally destroy our opportunity to meet anywhere near our Paris climate agreement. Plus it will signal to the rest of the world that it's okay to expand an airport because, look, the UK just did it. So we went to them and told them that if they voted in favour of it, that it was a crime against humanity. We really framed it around saying to them, you know, Nuremberg principles may apply in future to people who clearly voted to make this worse. We anticipate that the CEOs of fossil fuel companies who've suppressed evidence over the years and who've put out phony science will face criminal charges at some stage in the future. And these things can look backwards, and you can be held to account after the fact. So we really went in kind of heavy on the kind of emotive messaging. And again, you know, it's very uncomfortable for people when you say that you're going to go on hunger strike at them, and particularly if they're a progressive leftist party in their own minds. So on day 2, John McDonnell came and had a meeting with us. So again, you know, you get the Shadow Chancellor comes to speak to you after you've like starved yourself for only a day and a half and got a bit of press. So this is interesting kind of information for how these kinds of actions impact with speed, I suppose. So there have been many other campaigns. So if you look up Rising Up, you'll find out more about the things that people have tested and the work that they've done, and some of them have been quite successful. These are the kind of principles and values that Rising Up kind of laid the foundations for, and which Extinction Rebellion works with now. And because we're a decentralised network of people, we say that anybody can do anything in the name of Extinction Rebellion so long as it fits with these principles and values. So, for example, we maintain non-violent discipline, we recognise that we need a regenerative culture, so we try to put a lot of effort towards well-being, people care. This is a rebellion, it's not like one-off big action where everybody can like burn out afterwards and take a year off and go on a retreat and heal themselves because they've done themselves so much damage, which often happens to activists. We need people to be resilient and people to look after each other, so we try to really encourage that. We openly challenge ourselves. We recognise that the system itself is toxic. We're all part of that. We're all implicated by that fact. We reflect and learn. We run a lot of debriefs. So when we do an action, we all meet afterwards and have a debrief about what worked, what didn't work, what could we do differently. And we try to gather that wisdom and keep it in the building, so to speak, so that we can pass it on to other groups and so that we can share it with people who join. We don't do blaming and shaming. That's also really important. You might sort of want to point the finger at Theresa May and call her all kinds of names, but it's not really functional, doesn't help. So we avoid that, and it also means that if you're aiming at inclusivity across a broad political spectrum, if you avoid calling people out, then that's useful. We also know that internally it helps if you don't call people out, so we have a policy of not doing that on email threads or on Facebook chats or in public spaces or in meetings. So if we have a problem with anybody, we deal face to face or on the phone with that person, which helps to kind of have a good culture of interpersonal relationships. And autonomy and decentralisation are the key thing to be able to get something like this to grow at a very rapid speed. So that sort of often gets referenced as a sort of post-consensus mode of working. So if you want to form a little group and decide to go and do something, you can just go ahead and do it. And if we can help and you want to tell us what you're going to do, then maybe our press team can help, or maybe you can go and do some non-violent direct action training, or maybe you can go and learn how to be a legal observer. There's lots of things that we can help with people to train up to go and before they go and take action. So what we've achieved so far is important to sort of note, because I feel that the momentum is just building up again now for our second kind of like escalation. But in the first so the first round of like escalation, if you like, in the autumn, we recruited hundreds of thousands of supporters around the world. We've got, this number's out of date now, there are many more. There's lots of local councils have declared climate emergency. That includes the London Assembly and Sadiq Khan. It also includes now Lewisham, now Hackney. There's also Bristol, Cornwall, all over the country. Like local government are declaring emergency because they're under political pressure from their constituents, not all from XR, but quite a lot from small direct actions that local XR groups have done, which have really helped to like push all of that through, which is great. Also, all over the world, there are councils and local governments declaring an emergency. We launched the Tell the Truth campaigns, aiming at the BBC and the rest of the media, but largely at the BBC as a publicly owned institution, to ask them to tell the truth about climate change. That will be ongoing. We're just planning some more actions around the BBC now, but that was particularly good because people all around the country could go to BBC offices, say in Manchester, I think in Bristol, I think also in Cornwall, and also in the Midlands. So there's lots of places where the BBC have offices, so that was cool because local groups could just go to their local place. We went to the COP24 in Katowice in Poland, so we had some delegates, I guess you would call them, who went into the COP meeting and met with vulnerable island states who have been starting to use the language of extinction of their peoples recently, because they anticipate that some of the low-lying islands will go underwater and literally disappear. We also had activists out on the street outside the COP meeting who were working alongside, doing like workshops and trainings with international groups of activists. So that was interesting that we had that sort of like multi-pronged presence there. We think that we've already affected the narrative and the language around the situation that we're in, which is great. So linking biodiversity and ecological collapse more broadly in with climate change conversations. also bringing the language of societal collapse and food scarcity and other types of crises that we face, which if people don't have the language, they literally don't sort of talk about these things. And then we've laid the groundwork, hopefully, for this kind of radical reshaping of democracy, which is what we think is really necessary to be able to tackle this crisis in a meaningful way through assemblies and direct democratic process. So this was like an experiment with language, let's say, and there are mixed feelings among our sort of like broad ranks now whether you're allowed to say things like this, but I think you are, because I think we are really fucked, and nobody ever says it. So this was kind of trying to break through some barrier of saying, you know, movements and NGOs and campaign organisations, they usually sort of say, oh, there's something quite hopeful going on here, so if you give us £5 a month, and then if you give up like plastic straws, and if you walk your kids to school once a week, then you'll be all right. And we just thought it was good to sort of just put it on the table and say, you know, we think we are actually really fucked. So that's one thing that we did, which I think was quite radical, in the name of our top demand, which is tell the truth. So we're asking for these 3 demands to be met, and the first one is to tell the truth and then act as if that truth is real. We want the government to work potentially alongside the media to explain to citizens the actual risk and the threat of the crisis that we face, so that people understand the context of their own lives. And then the second demand is to act now. So we've suggested that net zero carbon emissions by 2025 is our top demand for this. It means that we would have to reverse policies that aren't in line with this, so no expansion of airports, and maybe investing in renewables and finding ways to support the tidal power projects, and finding ways to change the policies that they're writing, which are completely incompatible with a livable planet. And then our top demand, I think, is for a citizens' assembly. This is the most important one for me. This would mean structural political change. So we're not asking for some kind of concession by the government to say, you know, okay, well, we'll do a bit more of that, or, you know, we'll be a bit better on this, or we'll write some rules that mean we have to be stronger on meeting our Paris agreements. But we want to bring a system that would probably, and this needs to be firmed up by the body that sets it up, because we're not suggesting that we would start as our own citizens' assembly and run it. We want a citizens' assembly to be set up as a separate institution that is organised for ordinary citizens, like a jury, so picked at random, to come in and be educated on the topic of climate change and ecological breakdown, and then for those ordinary people to be empowered to discuss what are the best routes forward, given that we've had 30 years of inaction from our current political system. And if you look at citizens' assemblies around the world, there are recent examples, particularly the one I always use is in Ireland. It's not very far away. It was very recent when there was a debate on abortion. The Citizens' Assembly in Ireland really brought people together around an issue which was politically highly problematic. Some would say it was sort of politically toxic. So where politicians felt they couldn't talk about the issue, they couldn't even have a debate about making a decision because it was such a sort of divisive and difficult subject matter. Whereas if you get a room full of ordinary people and you educate them somewhat on politics and critical thought first, and then after that you educate them on all the issues, then you meet people who've been raped, you meet doctors, you meet women who've had abortions, women who've had bad abortions, women who've had to leave the country to do so, and you start to get this picture of what the actual issues are that are in front of you. Then a group of ordinary people can, of course, have like an informed and intelligent conversation. And if you look up the kind of after effects of that citizens' assembly, it really, really affected the way that that vote was made, it really affected the people in government, because the credibility of a group of ordinary citizens can't really be challenged in a democratic context. And it made it possible for them to talk about something which you might say structurally the politicians couldn't even really speak about it, so they were stuck. And so rather than talk about one politician doing the wrong thing on climate change, which God knows lots of them have done appalling things, they are so lobbied, they are so affected by all of the systems that are in place. There's no way that our political system can make any meaningful change of the scale and the speed that we need now, certainly. So we need some kind of structural change to the way that we organise our government. And so our plans for this year, we're already on the way with some of these things. We're recruiting people to undertake peaceful civil disobedience. There's support systems being set up to support those people, because as I said, for each person who gets arrested, you need a huge number of people working in other areas to help in the background. You create hundreds of groups that are decentralised. We've got, I don't know how many in the UK, I think it's over 100 local groups now, and there are groups popping up. There's, last time I checked, there was over 33 chapters in America. So there are certain countries where this is sort of blooming more than others, but they are all over the world now. We want to set up a citizens' assembly. That's been a little slower because we need some quite serious funding for that, so we're trying to find funding so that a separate body could set that up. In the meantime, we're going to roll out people's assemblies, which are kind of on the ground, kind of ways that like local communities can act out a kind of assembly setup. So we've got a guide to that explains how to facilitate it, how to set it up, and we're looking for some more funding to be able to put that out for people to work with their own local communities. We're supporting the school strikes movement as much as possible. If you're on strike, I know it's not quite the same for university students as it is for school students, but if you are on strike, I'll see you out there on Friday. We're engaging obviously directly with the government's culture and media to constantly keep asking for this telling of the truth. There's a new thing we've been working on called Culture Declares, which is asking institutions to declare climate emergency. So that's cultural institutions like theatres and arts centres and places like that, because I think that getting the cultural sector on board can be extremely useful. We also went and did lots of roadblocks around Fashion Week. That got us in the room with Caroline Rush from the British Fashion Council, which I would never have got a meeting with her like that the day before Fashion Week started, unless I threatened to like ruin her party. But that works, direct action works. There's an XR festival this weekend coming up of music and people training in non-violent civil disobedience, people learning their rights. There'll be lots of workshops, there'll be art workshops there as well, and that's in Bristol. That's Saturday and Sunday. Tickets are sold at cost, they're 20 quid. Do come if you can. A major publisher approached us and said they wanted us to do a book because they think they've got no future, because they think that everything's fucked. So we're putting together a book, and there's a series of short films that people have been making about what we're doing, and fundraising events, concerts. That's all kind of like the usual stuff ongoing. So there's lots to do. There's lots of direct actions planned. There's a big roadblock happening outside Dover, which you might have seen. We've got some press on that the other day in The Independent. All of our organising is above ground, so we don't do all that like secret kind of activism stuff where you can't tell anybody where you're going to be and what you're going to do, and you know, it means basically that you can't get anyone involved. So what organising above the ground does is that it makes it possible to have inclusion and mass participation, but it also helps to kind of like settle people's nerves. So if you know that the police know that you're going to go and do something that's a bit illegal, like go and shut down a road, then everybody is kind of a little bit more calm about the whole thing. And hopefully we've proved to the police over time now that we're quite predictable. We do pretty much what we say we're going to do when we show up and say we're going to like blockade something. That's what we do. So there's a big action happening in Dover at the end of the month if you want to go and shut down a motorway, which I think will be really fun, but I can't go, unfortunately. And then everything's pushing towards April the 15th, which is on these flyers. So on April the 15th, we'll be taking to the streets, and people will set up something, hopefully, that feels like a sort of beautiful, celebratory, a little like when we closed down all those 5 bridges at the same time. We had a kind of celebratory atmosphere on those, and music and speakers and children playing on the floor, and everything was very nice, you know, young and old people there. So hopefully, I think April 15th should be very much the same thing. And yesterday a group set off from Land's End to walk here. They're going to spend 5 weeks now walking to London, so that they arrive mid-April, where they're going to take to the streets in the rebellion, and then we're going to see how long we can stay out on the streets, basically, until the government speak to us directly. So so that's it. I guess you can ask any questions of us too.